If you're working as a health, fitness, or a wellness professional, you may be using supplemental Betaine HCL with some of your clients. And most clients that are dealing with stomach issues and symptoms that can come from low stomach acid or hypochlorhydria are usually just going to see improvement to those symptoms when they start supplementing with Betaine HCL and properly acidify that stomach so they can break down their food and get all the nutrients out of that food. But there are a subset of clients that will actually experience magnified or even new symptoms when they started supplementing with Betaine HCL. And a lot of the clients will just be like, ah man, that made me feel awful. I ain't doing that again. That wasn't right for me. What's wrong with you there, health professional? But the reality is that they just don't understand why those symptoms are coming about and steps they can take to correct those. Because a lot of these folks that experience symptoms when they first start supplementing with HCL are actually the people that need to acidify their stomach the most, and they really need the help. So in this video, I'm going to help you understand why these symptoms come up and steps you can take to help these clients correct the situation. Let's jump in.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
So in the description below this video, I'll put a link to this study that was talking about mealtime supplementation with Betaine HCL for functional hypochlorhydria. And that just meant that they were using PPIs to turn off someone's stomach acid, and then C, does supplementing with HCL during the meals help remove the symptoms that can show up from turning off stomach acid. So what they said was, furthermore, these data strongly suggest that supplemental mealtime Betaine HCL may be safe and appropriate and necessary in subjects on PPI therapy in order to decrease the common PPI side effects, as in protein micronutrient or drug malabsorption, food-borne microbial survival, or slow gastric emptying. So basically what they're saying was, when someone was turning off their stomach acid with these PPIs, using Betaine HCL supplemental capsules during the meal helped them improve the situation where they could acidify the food and actually get the nutrients out of that food and avoid all the symptoms that can come from low stomach acid. So if we can assume that that was working when they were turning off stomach acid on purpose, then we should be able to assume they could also help clients who are not making enough stomach acid even though they're not taking a medication to turn it off. There's a wide variety of reasons that a client might not be making enough stomach acid and be dealing with that hypochlorhydria issues and all the symptoms and issues that can come from an inability to truly break down that food and get all the nutrients out of that food. And if you're a consumer that's just happening upon this video, know that I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving anybody medical advice. And if you're working with a health professional, you really want to listen to what they're telling you to do because they understand your situation more than I would understand it. But if someone's going to start supplementing with HCL to help acidify their stomach correctly, some of the issues that have the ability to show up for some people can come from like a bacterial overgrowth. Like that study was mentioning, they were using that Betaine HCL to help reduce the odds of a bacterial overgrowth showing up. Well, that happens very commonly when there's not enough stomach acid there, because the acid is not just there to help us digest our food, it's the barrier to the whole digestive tract. So when these varmints come in on the food that we're eating, they die in an acid bath when the stomach is making enough stomach acid. So if stomach acid is low, it's very likely for a bacterial overgrowth to exist there. And the problem is that the waste product from a lot of these types of bacteria can be alkaline, and it's further alkalizing this stomach. And the client may be making a small amount of acid on their own, or maybe just the acid that they're making is getting neutralized by the alkaline waste from this overgrowth. So what will happen is, this overgrowth has all this alkaline waste, it's alkalizing the environment, they'll put a little bit of hydrochloric acid in there, and then this acid product meeting all that alkaline waste junk, those opposite pHs colliding, creates this sizzly, fizzy mess that can create a lot of discomfort in the stomach. So once this stomach acidifies food and leaves the stomach, it should meet alkaline bile, and then that sizzle helps us bust the food apart and get the nutrients out. But that should happen down in the duodenum. If it happens here in the stomach because the HCL is meeting with this alkaline waste, it can create a lot of discomfort there in the stomach. So the person will be like, oh man, that makes me feel lousy, I shouldn't be taking that. But the reality is they just need to take steps to reduce this overgrowth and reduce all the alkaline waste that it's creating so that the HCl can then acidify the food instead of creating a fizzy mess with the alkaline waste. So we like to see clients take steps like D-limonene or mastic gum or maybe drinking celery juice. There's a lot of steps available, both natural and medical, that a person could use to reduce any type of bacterial overgrowth there in the stomach as well as in the small intestine. Because if they're thriving in the stomach, they move down into the small intestine and then create that SIBO issue for a lot of clients. Another possible discomfort when first starting is acid reflux. Because remember, reflux is not usually caused by too much stomach acid like advertisers want us to believe. Reflux is usually caused by not enough stomach acid. There's this valve at the bottom of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter that opens so food can come in. And then once it starts to acidify, that valve closes so that the food doesn't come back up and burn us. The problem is that valve is triggered by stomach acid. So if a person is not making enough stomach acid to trigger that valve to close, the small amount of acid they have in there is going to come back up and burn them. And they're like, oh man, I got reflux, I got too much acid here. But really, if they had enough acid, they would trigger that valve, it would close, and the reflux wouldn't come back up. So if a person doesn't have any acid in there, and they're like, oh, I don't get reflux really, then they put a small amount of acid by adding a little bit of hydrochloric acid capsules. Now the small amount of acid is not enough to trigger that valve, but now there is acid in there, and the acid is going to come back up and burn them. And they're like, I never had reflux before, and now I'm adding more acid, so I'm getting reflux. So I must have too much acid, I got to stop taking this. But the reality was they wanted to take steps again to wipe out any bacterial overgrowth, because that waste in there can create more gases and pressure that can push more stuff back up. And if that alkaline waste is neutralizing the acid, then there's only going to be a small amount of acid left to come back up and not enough to trigger that valve to close. So if a person's having a little bit of reflux or maybe other signs of a bacterial overgrowth, maybe they're bloating a lot or something like that, then we like to see them take these steps before they start the HCl so that they don't have a chance of having that magnified reflux issue. Now, if a client is having a little bit of reflux when they first start, some people can use like a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar and just kind of take that down. And as the acid moves past that lower esophageal sphincter, that acid can trigger it sometimes to close enough to stop that reflux. Some clients might have success putting like just a little pinch of unrefined salt or sea salt on their tongue. And the minerals going past that LES sometimes have the ability to seem to tighten that up and help it close a little bit better too. And we also like to tell our clients that when they first start HCl, they want to start it with a meal that does not include higher levels of carbs or sugars. Because those carbs and sugars, if there's a bacterial overgrowth there, the carbs and sugars have the ability to kind of activate them and they create more gases and more pressure, and then you put that little bit of acid in there and now this bacteria is all activated, so it's pushing that acid back up and they get reflux. So those first meals, when they're first kind of ramping up that dose, they might just do like protein and maybe some green low carb vegetables and some dietary fats to kind of figure out, is it okay? But that doesn't mean that you can't have carbs when you're taking HCl. We just like to see them do that in the beginning to make sure they're not going to get some kind of magnified reflux symptom. And then once they're up to a dose that they feel like that they're really acidifying the stomach correctly and they're closing that valve, then they can test out putting carbs in there and it's usually going to be fine. And just keep in mind that the opinion is that when the human stomach is working correctly, it's usually going to make the equivalent HCl that equals about 2,500 milligrams of HCl capsules. So, but a person doesn't know how much they're making, so we like to see a client just start off with 1 in the middle of a meal and then work up to 2, 3, maybe 5 would be the equivalent of that 2,500 if they felt like they needed to go that high. I'm not telling somebody to go that high, but if the stomach is going to usually make 2,500 milligrams worth of HCl to acidify the food, then if they need to help it fully, if they weren't making any acid, then that might be an appropriate amount for them. We also like to see clients, for that reason, use an HCl that does not include pepsin. And pepsin is okay. Pepsin helps the digestive process. But if a person is going to work up to 5 capsules, that much pepsin has the ability to create some discomforts for a person. So we just like to see them use an HCl that does not include pepsin just in case they need to work up to a higher dose. Now another issue that can come about is loose stool issues. Now remember that once this food is acidified, it leaves the stomach and comes down into the duodenum, and then that acidity there triggers the gallbladder to squirt this alkaline bile down, and that's what helps neutralize those acids. And then this all triggers the pancreas to squirt some bicarb out there. That can help neutralize a little bit. But the bile is really the big player in helping to neutralize those acids. And the problem is a lot of clients have their bile that's too thick and sticky to flow correctly. So it's not coming down to help neutralize the acids. So if these acids don't get neutralized, they continue through the intestinal tract and can damage that lining. So the body's like, we don't want that. I'm going to bring all the water I can to cool this down and then rush it out the back door, and they get this crazy diarrhea. So if they didn't have stomach acid before and their bile flow was not moving, it wouldn't cause that loose stool issue because there's no acid that needs to be neutralized. There's no acid there. So they add acid in there, and now I have loose stool, and like, oh man, HCl gives you diarrhea. That's what happens. But that's not really what's happening. The body should be making HCl anyways. But if the bile is not flowing, then there's nothing to neutralize those acids, and that can loosen up that stool. So if a client sees that loose stool issue, then they really want to take steps to thin out the bile so that it can flow correctly and help neutralize those acids. They might want to hold off on this HCl until they can improve that bile flow. And if a client has lost their gallbladder, they might need to supplement with some ox bile to kind of create that synthesis of bile coming down to neutralize acids. And we'll put a link in the description below for our video on 6 steps for clients who have lost their gallbladder. And we'll point you towards some steps to help clients thin out that bile if you don't know how to do that in just a second. Other trouble, there could be some duodenal troubles. If a client's going to be supplementing with HCl, we don't even let them do that unless they're actively taking steps to make sure that the bile is thin and flowing correctly. Because if these acids are coming down here into the duodenum and they're not getting neutralized, it can kind of irritate the bottom of that duodenum and even into the intestinal tract, and it could create really a duodenal ulcer. If that's keep getting that acid going through there and not getting neutralized, that could create an irritation that in a severe case could create an ulcer. And we've never heard from a client that created a duodenal ulcer using HCl, but when you understand how this works and why people get duodenal ulcers, then it's really worth taking the steps to make sure the client's bile is thin enough to keep that flowing and make sure that that's not going to happen. Another thing to think about would be gastritis type pain. If a client had some gastritis or inflammation in this stomach lining and they put HCl in there, then that's going to be like acid going into like an open wound. That could really create a lot of burning and discomfort for them. And what you might have to discern is the client having discomfort because they have all this alkaline waste from a bacterial overgrowth and it's just the acid mixing with that alkaline creating the fizzy mess kind of discomfort? Or is it like a burning sharp pain that's burning an open wound of acid hitting some type of gastritis situation in that stomach lining? And if that's the case, then they would not want to use HCl until they corrected that. And we'll put a link in the description below for our video on how to improve gastritis. And we use things like cabbage juice, for a few weeks to help the client kind of heal that up before we would try the HCl again. What you don't want to see is a client's like, oh, I took an HCl capsule and that gave me gastritis. I got gastritis now. Because that's not how it's going to happen. You can't do that just adding an HCl capsule in there. The person already had gastritis, but since they weren't making any stomach acid, it wasn't creating the pain until they put acid in there. And you'll see from that video below that most gastritis issues actually happen from a lack of stomach acid. And then a bacterial overgrowth gets in there because there wasn't enough stomach acid to kill them off. And then they start to thrive and replicate and they create all that inflammation and problems to that stomach lining. So you can see that it's a possibility for a variety of issues to come up. Most people are not going to have any of these problems, but when they do, you want to understand what's creating the problem and the right steps to take. But the most often situation is that there's a bacterial overgrowth that's creating that discomfort when they put the acid in, or that the bile is not flowing well enough to neutralize the acids once they start acidifying that stomach. And that can be a really important step. So if you're new to this channel and you don't know the steps to really thin out the bile to make sure it's flowing correctly, you can jump over right now and check out our video on 5 steps to help clients improve bile flow. I can't wait to hear about your results.